Okay, 6 minute when I see it. You good?
Yep.
Because people deserve to live, I affirm resolved. The United States ought to require that workers receive a living wage. First, let's clarify some definitions. The Global Living Wage Coalition states that a living wage is the pay received by a worker in a particular place sufficient to afford a decent standard of living, including food, water, housing, healthcare, transportation, and other essential needs. As the word ought in the resolution indicates a moral obligation, the value or end goal of this round is justice, defined as giving each person his or her due. Governments exist to ensure equity in each citizen's well-being. Thus, the value criterion or means of achieving justice is maximizing societal welfare. Our first contention is that a living wage helps decrease poverty and wealth inequality. Subpoint A, rising income inequality. The Urban Institute writes in April, stating that wealth inequality is higher in the U.S. than in any other developed country and has risen for the past 60 years. In the past 60 years, America witnessed a massive transfer of wealth from the middle class to wealthiest families, who now have 71 times the wealth of families in the middle. This means that over the past 60 years, more and more Americans have been pushed to the brink of poverty. But how does poverty affect Americans? According to Vox in 2023, a single year of poverty is associated with 183,000 American deaths per year. To make things worse, wealth inequality is only predicted to rise even more, creating major issues for our society. Brookings writes in 2023, absent more responsive policies to combat inequality, the current high levels of inequality are likely to rise even further, which entails adverse economic, social, and political consequences. And history tells us that at large, rises in inequality can end up badly. Subpoint B is that a living wage would tackle the root causes of poverty and inequality. But what is the root cause of inequality? Dr. Bivens on the Economic Policy Institute explains that our rising inequality is being driven by the slowdown of wage growth for the bottom 90%. Essentially, the cost of living has massively outpaced minimum wages. In fact, when adjusted for inflation, the minimum wage today is lower than it was in 1970, while the cost of living has increased more than fourfold. However, a living wage would tackle the root cause of poverty by putting more money into the pockets of those who need it most. Professor Newmark examined 79 cities with living wage, concluding that living wage reduces poverty by 12%. Living wages help live families above the poverty line. But how does reducing poverty affect the rest of society? Or more importantly, how does it affect you? Well, senior policy analyst Alyssa Cunningham tells us that it isn't just individuals who benefit. The larger society also gains. They have better health, rely on government less on government social programs, are less likely to be incarcerated, and are more likely to engage in civic activities. That means an overall healthier, safer, and less expensive society. My second contention is that a living wage would benefit the economy. Now, this might seem unintuitive, as you would expect an increase in labor costs to hurt businesses. But raising the minimum wage to a living wage barely affects businesses at all. Subpoint A. A living wage barely increases business costs. To understand why, we need to understand that minimum wage workers make up a small percentage of total workers. That means that for businesses, only a minority of the workforce needs to be paid more than the living wage is implemented. That's why Professor Wells analyzed an empirical study that examines over 100 studies and finds that the cost of employers of living wage implementation are small, equivalent to 1% of total operating costs. That means that businesses are barely increasing their costs. Subpoint B is benefits. Now let's talk about the two ways living wage would benefit businesses. First, workers would reinvest back into the economy. With a living wage, workers around the country would be earning more money than before. With that additional wealth, workers will now be able to buy more things, creating more business for companies. Policy analyst Derek Cook examines 11 studies, knowing that a living wage causes low-wage households to spend more of their income in the city on locally produced goods. The article gives two examples showing that studies of living wage in San Francisco result in an additional $20 million per year flowing into the city's economy, while a study of Santa Rosa found that a living wage circulates an additional $23 million. $20 million additional dollars a year sounds like a lot, but how much is that increase in percentage? Professor Paulin explains that a living wage would bring in an additional 2.7% in sales to retail businesses. For business, this 3% increase in profit would already be more than enough to cover the 1% increase in costs. The second way a living wage would benefit businesses is by increasing worker productivity. In fact, according to the Harvard Business Review, wage hikes increase productivity. This is because higher pay increases worker morale and makes being more productive worth it. In fact, Professor Coviello examines over 40,000 workers across the U.S., concluding that for worker productivity, a $1 increase in minimum wage increases performance by 22%. That means on top of the increased consumer spending, you also have increased worker productivity. And empirically, that creates thriving business. That's why the University of Cambridge conducted a meta-study in 2024 and concluded that for businesses, research shows that living wages improve revenues and profit. That's I affirm.
Okay. Stop watch for crosshairs. Let me know when you're. You ready?
Yep.
Okay. So I just want to clarify your first contention. You're first saying that right now we have extremely high income inequality. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Over the past 60 years, we've seen that the wage gap in America has divided more and more, and that at the current moment, the cost of poverty means death for 183,000 Americans per year.
Okay, so how would giving a living wage increase or decrease income inequality?
As we understand, the minimum wage pertains to a portion of workers in the bottom half. And as I've noted, over the last 60 years, we've seen that the middle, or the people who are in the middle of the economy, the middle class, have vastly been outshone by those in the upper class. So when you raise the bar on the bottom, the people who are on the bottom 90% are being paid more in minimum. Thus, they're able to buy things like food, or or water, or any sort of clothing or necessities to pay for healthcare.
Okay, so in order to solve a significant amount of the issues that income inequality presents, exactly how much would we have to pay this bottom 90% of workers? How much would we increase their wages by?
I think that varies from county to county, but we're debating on principle here about the nature of living wages.
Okay, but the principle also comes with costs. I just want to know exactly how expensive this would be.
We don't have a plan text for this, so I can't specify that.
Well, I'm not saying that you're implementing this as a plan. I'm just saying, how much do we have to pay these workers so that we won't see the issues of income inequality anymore?
I think it varies from county to county. You're asking about San Jose, you're asking about Iowa, you're asking about...
Give me any examples.
I'd say, given that on my second contention, I talk about the total cost over 100 cities, and they found that the net spending would be enough to provide them with the means to pay for necessities, and that varies. We don't have specifications for that.
So in those studies, you said there was 100 studies conducted, and not one single, not even one of those studies mentioned how much these workers were actually paid.
We found that the cost of implementing a living wage only up business cost by 1%. We found that the impacts any sort of doubling or tripling that you might suggest in your next speech are less than 1% of total compensation.
So you're saying that there were 100 studies that showed that living wages only costed 1% of
for
total
companies.
costs.
That's correct.
Okay, so that means there were 100 examples of companies switching to a living wage. So all I'm asking you is to tell me how much they were paid before and how much they were paid after.
I can't give you a flat figure.
You can't tell me.
Well, the minimum wage right now varies from city to city in California and San Jose.
I'm saying in these 100 studies that you're presenting me.
I can't list every single study for the...
In any one of those studies.
I can't specify that.
Okay, so we don't have a sense of what these workers were paid before, how much they'll be paid after. Do we have any range at all of how much will contribute or will lead to decreased harms from income inequality?
Can you clarify your question? Are you asking how much we have to pay them? Or what's the...
I'm just saying, for an increase from their minimum wage to a living wage, what is the gap that we have to cover in order to not see income inequality anymore?
I would say that varies from city to city, and we have to...
Give me one example of one city. Maybe San Jose. How much would that require in San Jose?
San Jose would be $16, and the living wage would be about $32.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to take...
You're running prep, you're good.
Starting... 58.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me know when you're ready.
I'm good, yeah.
Reality over idealism. That should be the theme of today's round. Now, while the intentions of my opponent are admirable, there's a reason why radical policies like a living wage haven't succeeded in the past. When our noble intentions turn into hasty ideas, our entire country feels the consequences. So because a living wage would tip over our carefully balanced economy, I am proud to negate the resolution. Resolved, the United States ought to require that workers receive a living wage. Now first, let's define what a living wage actually is. Professor Glasmeyer from MIT states that a living wage is what one full-time worker must earn on an hourly basis to cover the cost of their minimum basic needs where they live. But what does this practically look like? Now, according to the consensus living wage calculator from MIT, which calculates the cost of necessities like food and shelter, a living wage would, on average, double or triple that current region's minimum wage. For example, the current minimum wage in San Jose is $16, so the living wage would be $32. Therefore, my only observation is that evidence examining slight increases in minimum wage cannot be used to support the idea of a living wage. Instead, we should only look at evidence that specifically mentions how much a living wage was increased by during that example. And I also agree with my opponent's morality framework of justice and maximizing societal welfare. Now on to my first contention of unemployment. By doubling or even tripling the wages that employers have to pay their employees, the business is forced to significantly cut costs, and one of these ways being worker layoffs. According to Dr. Trimbraj from just this August, the living wage should not be pushed up by more than 30%, because if it is raised too high, low-skilled workers get displaced. Now, Dr. Rutkowski furthers this with an empirical example, noting that when the minimum wage in Puerto Rico was raised by 70%, the island experienced massive job losses and a substantial rise in unemployment. The Fraser Institute gives us a further evidence by analyzing 140 American cities that implemented a living wage, concluded that employers respond to living wages by cutting back on jobs, hours, and training. According to research by leading scholars, a 100% increase in the living wage reduces employment among low-wage workers by 17%. Now, all of these examples display significant layoffs for a wage increase of 100% at most. Remember that the affirmative is proposing a 200 to 300% increase. Now, my opponent might come up in their next speech to argue that this increase in income offsets the decrease in employment. However, research shows that because of unemployment, overall payment of U.S. workers decreases. Professor Withers examines data from all 50 states, concluding that increases in reduced low-skilled individuals' average monthly incomes was $150. Now, my second contention is that a living wage leads to mass inflation. In response to having double or triple wages, companies would need to significantly raise prices. Dr. Rankin examines states in the US and the EU, concluding that when the minimum wage increases by 20%, inflation more than doubles, because stores make up a larger share of low-income households' budgets. These households are hit the most by price increases. Consumers, rather than firms, bear the cost of wage increases, and that's only a 20% increase. Households in poverty, which, may I remind you, is the key people that my opponent is trying to help, would get hit magnitudes harder if the wage was doubled or even tripled, like it will be with living wage. Now, according to Belent Devrishi, who is a professor of International Vision University, a 12.56% increase in the minimum wage in 2023 triggered a price level doubling due to both the increase in demand and decrease in supply. Now, at the end of the day, my opponent is trying to promote solving income inequality through a living wage and supporting the bottom 90% of America. However, as we've seen through empirical studies that looked at living wage increases less than what he's proposing we do, those people are hit magnitudes worse than the top 10%, or the wealthy. Now, moving on to my opponent's case. He first talks about, in his first contention of poverty, he talks about how we have high income inequality, there's 183,000 deaths from poverty, and that inequality is only on the rise. But remember, his job is also to present the idea that a living wage given to all of America will actually help solve this income inequality. But as I just explained, we've already seen how people who are affected the most by income inequality are also harmed the most by a living wage. This is because when we increase the living wage, when we increase wages by 200 to 300%, we not only cause significant layoffs, meaning these people at the bottom 90% no longer have a job, but we also rapidly increase inflation for the entire country, meaning these people won't even be able to buy goods with their newfound wages. Next, he talks about how he uses his Newmark card to say that living wages decreases poverty by 12%. But the card also explicitly says it's coupled with employment reductions. So we're also taking into account the fact that tens of thousands of people will be laid off, and we've seen that happen in other countries like in Brazil that I mentioned in my case. Next, I assure you in his next speech, he's going to lean on his wills card, which talks about how the living wage is approximately just 1% of the cost. That is why I asked him to name explicit increases in the living wage from those studies. He says there were 100 studies done in America, and yet he can't even name how one study increased the living wage by 20%, 30%, 100%. So what I will provide you is the examples from my case that all discussed examples have how the living wage increased by 100%, 70%, and 30%, and every single one of them resulted in mass inflation and mass unemployment. So, until my opponent can come up to you and give you a piece of evidence that says that a living wage increase of 200 to 300% will not cause significant harm to the economy and our society, then you must vote for the negative. And finally, he uses cards from Cook to talk about how reinvestment will help the economy, how it will generate $20 million, how it also contributes to an increase in sales and productivity. But remember, at the end of the day, these studies were only taken to look in a vacuum of a small increase in living wage. Remember that we're not even going to have access or see these benefits at all if we were to implement a national living wage, because in the first place, our economy is going to collapse from extreme inflation, and the people who are trying to help with this beneficial proposition of a living wage will ultimately be harmed the worst due to unemployment.
Okay.
I'm ready for questions.
What's your case? I just want to make sure I have your case on. I just want to specify like.
It's in there. Yeah, it's in there.
Let me find it.
You might. I didn't put it in the website. I put it in the files. Maybe it's not in the website yet.
Yeah.
You see it?
Trying to like check one thing. Just looking for one card, then I'll ask that, and then I'll start. Okay, first I want to start on your definitions, because in this round, the key debate we're going to have here is whose side should we prefer for definitions? Why should the judge prefer your definitions from the MIT calculator over ours from the Global Living Wage Coalition?
Yeah, of course. So first of all, the MIT calculator is an empirical analysis of different factors within every single region of America specifically, so therefore it's specific to this topic. And also, most of the scholarship within the US uses the MIT calculator explicitly, and it essentially is the only definition within today's round to actually give us a concrete sense of, a concrete and numerical sense of how the living wage is going to increase.
Okay, great. Moving down your first contention, under your Puerto Rico evidence, can you just clarify the warrant of that card real quick? I must make sure this thing's on. It's
Okay.
sorry. Under your Murkowski evidence, can you clarify what your warrant is for the minimum wage in Puerto Rico and how that was compared? Like, what was that increase in living wage
Murkowski
compared
evidence?
to? Yeah.
This is under unemployment or
It
inflation?
is unemployment. It's your first contention.
Rutkowski, you mean?
Yeah, you talk about the
Okay,
minimum wage being
Murkowski.
raised about 70% of the manufacturing wage. What is the average manufacturing wage?
The average manufacturing rate?
Yeah, in your card it says that the minimum wage in Puerto Rico is raised by about 70% over the average
I'm
manufacturing.
going to be completely honest. I do not know the Puerto Rican minimum wage at the time, but the card mentions how it would increase from 70% of what it was, and I believe that's sufficient evidence. I mean,
So you don't know what the jump was.
Well, the jump was 70%.
Yeah,
It was a
from what?
70% increase.
Yeah, but it could be $4 an hour to $7.80, but that's not like. Do you know what the average
Well, the
manufacturing?
point of the card was to demonstrate how a percent increase in a minimum wage leads to a specific percent.
Yeah, you're giving point A and
consequence.
point B, but can you specify what the average manufacturing wage was for Murkowski?
I do not know the average minimum wage
Okay.
in Puerto Rico.
Great. Moving down your case. Under your American evidence, what states in the U.S. and the EU were analyzed? Like, how broad is the scope? Like, can you?
If you want a list of specific states, I'm sorry, I do not know the specific states.
Okay.
If it helps, I know that it covered the entire state, so it was looking at the state.
Can I clarify what your on your Vesci evidence?
Is it inflation?
It's your inflation. You're saying
Correct.
a 12.56% increase in minimum wage in 2023 triggered with a bracket in the middle. Isn't that an ethics violation for cutting evidence?
No, because this was an event.
What?
This was in North Macedonia.
Okay, I'm gonna stop right there. Like, I'm asking like out around like.
No, it's fine. It's fine. It's fine. Because it's just changing the. This is quoting someone that said
You can't add
will
quotes.
increase. Huh? Yes, you can add brackets. You've never done that?
No, I talked. No, this happened earlier. I was talking to like Caleb and Elliot and like Summer. You can't do that.
Yes, you can.
You can.
Yes, you
You
can.
can't add words to a card, dude.
Yes, you can. Because I'm not changing the meaning of the card. It's just to make the phrasing sound better. You've never seen that?
I don't like. I'm gonna ask. Like, I've never seen someone say, "Well, increase."
Bro, we've been doing that for years. It doesn't, because as long as it doesn't change the meaning of the card. You can catch me on a violation if it changes it. But it doesn't change
Okay,
it.
like, can I just have like the original like card before like doubling? Like it says like.
That is the original card. It's just the doubling is the only thing added. There's nothing removed.
Well, you're
It's
saying
just added.
we'll increase, but double is not part of the.
Well, it says we'll increase twice. That's so I'm just changing doubling so I don't have to say price level twice. You see how that's weird? It's just change. It's not changing the
Okay.
meaning of the card. It's just changing the phrasing.
Crap. It was 2:30 or 1:30. I have 2:30 left. Okay, format 1 Are you good?
Oh, Rebecca.
Just gonna do a half case response to egg. Right.
Okay.
When considering the value criterion of maximizing societal welfare, this round comes to which side of this debate adequately provides the most good for the most people. Thus, when we considering this resolution of should the United States ensure a living wage, it's clear that you have to vote for the F. Now, starting in my case, I want to clarify the definitions debate. Now, the negative in the last speech came up and talked about the MIT calculator and tried to contextualize the nature of a living wage. Now, I have a handful of responses for this. You should prefer a definition of living wage for a couple of reasons. First, our definition cites global consensus on the definition of living wage, while the negation only cites the United States. Second, our definition has been peer-reviewed by highly qualified PhD-level researchers in fiscal policy around the world. And finally, it's the most recent. We said evidence from July of this year. So thus, you should prefer the F definition, but even if you prefer the neg definition, our case still holds up. Now, under my first contention, the negative concedes every single piece of harms that I have, only giving me your responses. Remember, over the last 60 years, the US is the only developed country to have the highest gap in wealth inequality. And this is a product of wage income slowdown. For the middle class and the bottom 90%, they're not getting paid nearly enough. And the minimum wage you have now will be the same you'd have in 1970, while the cost of living is 4 times. And additionally, remember this number at the end of this round. the cost of poverty is 183,000 deaths per year. The NEG understands all of this. And they want to insist on continuing to live in a world where we allow the poorest of the poor to die and people on the margins to be squashed out. But a living wage addresses the root causes. He notes my vivid evidence talking about how a fiscal slowdown of 90% screw people over. And additionally, the Newman evidence talking about a living wage reduces poverty by 12%. We provide examples telling you that when you have a living wage, the people who are on the margins are generally treated for the better. Additionally, my Cunningham evidence provides the fact that upping living wage affects the society as businesses and companies are able to provide for themselves. But here's where most of it gets eroded. In the second contention, the negative gives them multiple responses. They're trying to extend their own case. They talk about unemployment, inflation, and unemployment. But I have two responses for this. First, under inflation, remember, they meant that a living wage would not cause inflation. First, because any increases in prices would be offset by the increases in purchasing power. Remember, even if you're paying people double and triple, that means that even if the market rises, the people who are being paid this can accommodate that reasonably. Second, that likely wouldn't even happen. Remember my Willis evidence from 100 studies that found that the cost of implementing living wage would only up the costs of businesses by 1%. And remember my Pollen evidence, which says that when you implement living wage, businesses increase their profits by 2.7%. I'm not a math major, but 2.7 minus 1 is 1.7%, which means that they fit those profit margins easily. So the threat of inflation is not significant. Now onto unemployment. They mentioned this as well. And there's a handful of reasons why living wage would not cause unemployment. Look, you have to realize that this sort of argument that allowing people to survive on their wages is bad because it might increase costs for businesses is the exact kind of rhetoric that's been used for the past 50 years to justify and profit off of poverty. That's why the first piece of evidence I read to you in my last speech reads that the poor are exploited. The poor are unlucky or doomed. They're exploited by prioritizing profit over well-being. Next, the negative also concedes the fact that businesses see that when you up living wage by $1, you see a 22% increase in profit margins. That means any threat of unemployment or inflation are offset by the general cost of businesses. And sure, even with the minor threat of some unemployment, on the whole, we've proven through our Cambridge evidence and our Kobiela evidence that our society as a whole responds in tune. Under their case, there are 2 points of contention are unemployment and inflation. I responded that to my app. You can cross-apply all my responses from my empirical examples. They provide instances of Murkowski evidence in Puerto Rico. They can't specify what the minimum or the average manufacturing wage was. So they don't understand their evidence. You shouldn't consider that. Additionally, every other empiric they give you can be offset by our other empirics. At the end of this round, when you're comparing these 2 cases, you have to acknowledge the definitions. And as I've proven, the app wins on both fronts, because either you prep our definitions for a living wage as necessities, or even if that you find that the cost of businesses would not be significant enough to cause major harm. Thus I affirm.
Okay. Now we're going to take the rest of my prep. Starting. Okay. This will be the final negative speech, 6 minutes.
Beautiful. Can I robot?
It's just going to be neg the math.
Awesome.
Judge, I know that things may have gotten a little bit messy, a little bit into the weeds during today's round. So let's simplify everything that happened today using one mindset: realism. We need to make sure that we are not putting ideals over real world practice. Now, while it's awesome that my opponent has noble intentions, and while I agree that we should help people who are the poorest among us and that we should stop income inequality, we have to remember that in today's round, my opponent is proposing establishing a national living wage to solve that. And as I've proven, and will continue to prove, a living wage is simply too radical of an idea to tackle this problem. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think income inequality is a problem, but presenting the living wage as a solution will only make things worse. In his last speech, my opponent talked about how he is maximizing societal welfare, but ultimately, through implementing a national living wage, all we're going to be doing is generating rampant unemployment and inflation, the likes of which the US has never seen before. And the reason why we know that is because throughout all the examples that I've presented of inflation or unemployment rising, whenever we have a 20%, 30%, 70%, 100% increase in wages, remember that we've never seen a 200% or 300% increase to the scale of that my opponent is proposing. Now first, onto the definitions debate. He first says that you should prefer his definition of his global definition because the MIT definition is only used in the US and it's not backed by global experts. But it appears he's forgotten what his actual definition is. His definition essentially says the same thing as the MIT's beginning lines, which is saying enough money to have a decent standard of living. Do you know what his definition doesn't provide? An actual number or percentage of how much that living wage is actually going to increase by. So the global definition and MIT definition are the same in their principle, except the MIT did more work to analyze the US specifically, which by the way is what is in the context of today's resolution, and it analyzes it to see exactly from county to county how much the living wage will increase by. That is why the MIT definition is the only definition for today's round, because both fundamentally agree, but the MIT definition goes further to present an actual accurate concrete number. And my opponent has yet to dispute that, and he cannot, as it is far too late in today's round. Now, onto the case of the negative. My opponent responds to my contention about unemployment by saying that the living wage in my Puerto Rico evidence was not specified, and that I'm untrustworthy because I don't know my evidence. But that detail doesn't matter. The point of that evidence was to demonstrate the fact that a 70% increase in living wage would lead to massive unemployment that almost crippled the country. And remember that we're not just doing a 70% increase in the living wage. We're doing a 200 to 300% increase. Now, even though the U.S. has a far greater population than Puerto Rico, we're still going to see magnitudes of the most poor people in America finding themselves without jobs. Because when you have to triple the costs that businesses are paying to their employees, people are eventually going to be cut off. Now, my opponent also says that this is going to be offset by productivity. Now, first of all, this ignores that millions of the poorest individuals are going to be without jobs. So it looks like he doesn't care about that. But going even further, he says that a $1 increase in the minimum wage leads to 22% in productivity. He doesn't give us a way for us to quantify that. How much money will that increase the economy by? How will that actually be enough to offset the unemployment and inflation? And I can tell you for a fact, it doesn't. And he fails to respond to my card from Withers, which already condemned this argument in the 1NC, saying that there is no way for a living wage to offset the impacts of unemployment. Through 100 different cities analyzed throughout the US, this card found that overall, on average, monthly wages went down because living wages could not offset the effects of unemployment and inflation. Now, that leads me into my inflation contention, which he responded the same thing by saying the effects of inflation will be offset. Remember that when you're increasing costs by 200 to 300%, companies need to find a way to make more money. They're going to raise their prices. This is just intuitive. So suddenly tripling the costs of all businesses in America and saying that prices won't increase to a point that's absurd, that idea in itself is absurd. Now, finally, to quickly go over my opponent's case, he first just talks about how the negative, and insisting on the deaths of income inequality. But like I said in my intro, I am not supporting the deaths of people in poverty, but I am also not supporting the solution that he presents. And finally, he just asserts his offset argument again, which I already demonstrated to you, which I am the only one in this round to give you an actual card that explicitly mentions how and why a living wage cannot offset unemployment and inflation. So at the end of the day, we have to be realists in order to judge today's round. We have to understand that this is a complex, nuanced issue, and jumping the gun to establish a living wage to try to solve the noble intention of income inequality is far too rash to especially apply to the entire country. When we make rash decisions like that, the poorest individuals, the people we're trying to help, are going to be affected disproportionately. And because we want to avoid that at all costs, you must vote negative.
You're going to grab voters for the 2AR? You good?
Yep.
Once again, at the end of this round, when considering the value criterion to maximize societal welfare, we have to gauge both sides of this debate. Now, the negative has done a phenomenal job of trying to present themselves as someone who is not complicit in multiple atrocity, but someone who's trying to present tragedy. And while they're well-intentioned, this simply isn't true. Remember, the status quo that we live in, over the last 60 years, we've seen that the wage gap only continues to widen and widen. And year over year, hundreds of thousands of people are dying to poverty. And sure, they've tried to suggest that through multiple empirical examples that you'll see worse issues on the whole. And the heart of their 2NC, or 2NR rather, that the AF could not provide a single example or any numbers that would prove that the costs of a living wage wouldn't be offset by cost and purchasing power. But they failed. As I go down this, my voters, I will prove to you why we've empirically and with numbers proven that the AF world is possible. Now into the first issue of poverty. Let's recap. In the world of the status quo, poverty is deadly. 183,000 people die per year as a byproduct of not having enough to live. Additionally, remember that the bottom 90% have 73% less times the wealth of those that are the top of the top. But living wage resolves this. Remember, the NEG never responded to the fact that living wage reduced poverty by 12%. This isn't just an issue for the poor people on the whole when we up businesses and other communities on the whole, society benefits. People can have health benefits. People can buy food and water and healthcare. They're able to treat themselves. So on the whole, we deal with the root cause of poverty, the real harms of this round. Now to the second contention. Look, the NEG has done a phenomenal job of trying to paint a dangerous picture of the future being through speculation. And whereas rhetoric holds strong, we've given you numbers that prove that this isn't a real threat. Remember, I've proven that the cost of living wage would only cost businesses a 1% increase in annual spending. Yet implementing a living wage would up sales by 2.7%. Remember, I'm not a math major, but 2.7 minus 1 is 1.7. So on the whole, the businesses would still profit. And even so, these people being paid more on the whole, even if you have any sort of inflation, they can then buy things on the market and fund the economy to stay consistent. The NEG doesn't neglect this. We've given you numbers here, and they try to say that I don't have anything, but they're lying. Finally, talk about extending on to purchasing power. When you give people more money to buy things, even if you have the risk of potential unemployment, we've proven that on the whole, when you're paying the bottom 90% of the population more on net, you see general positive outcomes in general. Remember, for every $1 one person is paid more per hour, you see a 22% increase in productivity. That means our businesses work better, that our communities stay coherent, and that the people on the margins are able to pay for the things that allow them to live. Thus, because the affirmative holds up the value criteria and maximum societal welfare, I affirm.
Good on.
Make sure I can stop this and don't die on me.